By the time the workers finished filling in the moats, Yododono understood what had happened. She was the mother of Toyotomi Hideyori, the last heir of the clan that had unified Japan, and she had spent the winter of 1614 watching Tokugawa Ieyasu's army surround Osaka Castle, the largest, most heavily fortified castle in Japan, without being able to breach it. The siege had lasted weeks. The walls had held. Hideyori's generals, including the brilliant and ferociously loyal Sanada Yukimura, had held the outer defenses against an army twice their size. By January 1615, it was Ieyasu who faced a problem. He could not take the castle by force. Winter was making logistics difficult, and his coalition of daimyo had its own tensions and its own calculations about how long they wanted to be camped in the cold outside Osaka. So, he offered peace. The terms were, on the surface, reasonable. Hideyori would keep his life, keep his income, keep Osaka as his domain. All he had to do was allow the outer moats to be filled in. Just the outer moats, a gesture of good faith, a sign that the war was truly over. Within days of the treaty being signed, the workers were filling not just the outer moats, but the inner ones. When Hideyori's representatives complained, indignantly, furiously, because this had not been part of the agreement, the Tokugawa officials expressed regret at the misunderstanding and said the workers had simply misunderstood their instructions. The work continued. By the time it stopped, Osaka Castle had been stripped of the water defenses that made it impregnable. The greatest fortress in Japan had been turned, through a peace treaty, into a building with good walls and no moat. Ieyasu returned to Kyoto to meet the emperor and inform him that the war was over. He had already ordered his gunsmiths to manufacture more cannon. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had spent most of his life without a son. He had risen from a peasant, the son of a foot soldier, born without the samurai lineage that Japanese society required for advancement, to become the man who unified Japan after a century and a half of civil war. He had done this through a combination of military brilliance, ruthless political instinct, and an ability to inspire loyalty in men who had no particular reason to give it. He had been Oda Nobunaga's most effective general, and after Nobunaga's assassination, he had moved faster than anyone else to seize control of the succession, and from there to the unification of the country. By the 1590s, he was regent of Japan, the effective ruler of a nation that had been fragmented within living memory, commanding armies large enough to attempt an invasion of Korea, which he attempted twice, and which failed twice, and which was the kind of failure that does not happen to men who are going to live long enough to correct it. He died in 1598. He was 62 years old. His son Hideyori was 5. Before he died, Hideyoshi extracted promises from the men who mattered, the 5 senior lords who would form the Council of Regents, the 5 commissioners who would administer the government, that they would protect his son, maintain his succession, and not allow any one lord to dominate the others. Tokugawa Ieyasu was the most powerful of the 5 elders. Ieyasu signed the promise. He was 55 years old when Hideyoshi died, and he had been waiting for an opportunity for decades, and his signature on that document was the signature of a man who understood what promises were for. Within 2 years of Hideyoshi's death, Ieyasu had broken the coalition and fought the Battle of Sekigahara, a massive engagement in 1600 that settled, in a single day, the question of who would control Japan. He won. The Toyotomi faction that had opposed him was destroyed or scattered. Hideyori, 7 years old, was still alive in Osaka Castle, still the son of the man who had unified Japan, still technically the higher-ranking lord by the formal structures of the court, because the imperial hierarchy that Hideyoshi had built his legitimacy on didn't simply evaporate because Ieyasu had won a battle. The problem of Hideyori was not a military problem in 1600, it was a political and symbolic problem, and it would remain one, getting slowly worse, for the next 14 years. Ieyasu arranged for his granddaughter Senheim to marry Hideyori in 1603, the same year he was appointed shogun, a position he held for 2 years before transferring it to his son Hidetada, demonstrating that the shogunate was now a hereditary Tokugawa institution rather than a personal achievement. The message was explicit. This was not one man's power, it was a dynasty, and Hideyori, whatever his father's legacy, whatever the court hierarchy said about his rank, was not part of it. He met Hideyori in person only once, in 1611, at Nijo Castle in Kyoto, where Ieyasu had gone to attend the abdication of Emperor Goyose. The young man who came to that meeting was not what Ieyasu had perhaps expected. He was 18 years old, tall, composed, and he had declined the seat of honor Ieyasu offered him on the grounds that Ieyasu was his senior and his father-in-law, a gesture of formal courtesy that was also, read carefully, a statement. I am not diminished. I know my position. I am choosing deference rather than having it imposed on me. Contemporary accounts describe Ieyasu leaving the meeting disturbed. Whether this is apocryphal or not, and much of what we know about Ieyasu's inner life comes from sources with their own agendas, what is certain is that after 1611, the pace of preparations for a confrontation accelerated on both sides, and that by 1614, Hideyori had assembled in Osaka Castle a force of over 100,000 men, including every major commander who had reason to hate the Tokugawa, and that Ieyasu had decided that the problem he had been managing for 15 years needed to be solved. The man who ordered the moats filled was 71 years old in 1614 and had been waiting to solve the Toyotomi problem since 1598. Tokugawa Ieyasu is one of the most studied figures in Japanese history, which means he is also one of the most mythologized. The Tokugawa shogunate that he founded lasted 250 years, and for most of that time, it had strong institutional reasons to present its founder in the most favorable possible light. So the historical record is thick with accounts of his wisdom, his patience, his strategic genius, and thin on accounts of the things he did that were simply ruthless. He was ruthless. He had spent 60 years in a political world where the distance between ambition and execution was measured in the lifetimes of everyone around you, and he had survived that world. And arriving at 71 as the most powerful man in Japan was not the achievement of a patient man who had waited for good things to happen to him. It was the achievement of a man who understood that patience, deployed correctly, was itself a weapon. He had a reputation for finding ways around agreements he had made. The story told by Sanada Yukimura's faction, and Sanada hated Ieyasu with a clarity that produced some memorable speeches, was that Ieyasu had once negotiated peace with a group of warrior monks by swearing their temples would be restored to their original state. After signing, he burned the temples to the ground. He had kept his word, he said, with a straight face. The sites had been restored to their original state, which was empty fields. Whether this story is literally true, it was believed, which tells you something about the reputation Ieyasu had built over 60 years of operating in exactly this way, finding the gap between what was promised and what was technically possible, and stepping through it with a calm explanation. When the Bell incident gave him his pretext for war, he did not hesitate. In 1614, Hideyori commissioned the restoration of the Hokoji Temple in Kyoto, a project begun by his father, a gesture of piety and filial continuity, the kind of thing a young lord with more money than political power does to maintain his standing. The temple's great bronze bell required a dedicatory inscription. The inscription read, among other things, "May the country be at peace," Koka Anko, and "May lords and servants be rich and cheerful," Kunshin Horaku. The Tokugawa scholars who examined the inscription found what they were looking for. The characters for Ieyasu's name, Jiakang, appeared in Koka Anko, split apart, separated, cursed. The characters Lichen, Toyotomi, appeared in Kunshin Horaku, reversed, suggesting the Toyotomi would rise again. Hideyori was cursing the shogun in bronze. He was announcing his intention to overthrow the Tokugawa. It was all there, for anyone who knew how to read it in the particular way that made it mean what the Tokugawa needed it to mean. The temple's abbot and Hideyori's advisors tried desperately to explain that the inscription was a conventional Buddhist prayer, that the characters were being read in the most uncharitable possible way, that this was not what the text meant. None of this mattered. The Tokugawa interpretation was the one that counted. Ieyasu mobilized his army that autumn. Osaka Castle in 1614 was probably the most formidable fortification in Japan. Hideyoshi had built it over decades, a massive complex of stone walls, towers, and multiple rings of moats sitting on a natural plateau above the surrounding plain, designed to be held by a relatively small force against a much larger attacker. By the time Ieyasu's army arrived in the winter of 1614, Hideyori had reinforced it further and recruited an army of roughly 100,000 men, including an extraordinary concentration of capable commanders who had fought on the losing side at Sekigahara and had been waiting 14 years for an opportunity to reverse the outcome. The most important of these was Sanada Yukimura. He had fought against Ieyasu at Sekigahara as part of the Western Coalition, had survived the defeat through luck and the intercession of his father, and had spent the following years in exile on Koyasan, a monastic mountain, a place of enforced stillness, living on a stipend, watching the Tokugawa consolidate. When Hideyori's invitation came in 1614, he answered it immediately. He arrived at Osaka Castle and earned his reputation in the first weeks of the siege. His red armored troops built an independent fortification south of the castle called the Sanada Maru, a forward position that the Tokugawa forces kept assaulting and kept failing to take, at costs that mounted fast enough to be embarrassing. When Ieyasu offered him 100,000 koku to switch sides, Sanada published the bribery attempt publicly so that everyone could see what the Tokugawa were willing to do when they couldn't win by fighting. Ieyasu tried to bribe a subordinate commander instead. The man was caught and executed. The siege produced one of its strangest episodes that winter. Ieyasu, having failed to breach the walls by conventional assault, ordered his English-purchased culverins, massive cannon, each weighing nearly 2 tons, trained directly on the tower where Yododono kept her private apartments. Not on military positions, not on the walls. On the room where Hideyori's mother lived, the cannon fired. The tower was hit. Several of her ladies-in-waiting were killed. Contemporary accounts describe her as shattered by the bombardment, unable to sleep, pushing Hideyori toward accepting peace. Whether this result was the accidental byproduct of artillery fire aimed at a convenient target, or a deliberate calculation by a 71-year-old man who had been thinking about how to break this castle for years, the accounts are ambiguous, and the ambiguity is itself revealing. Ieyasu did not fire cannon at random. The peace terms that ended the winter campaign guaranteed Hideyori's life, his income, and his domain. His mother would not be made a hostage. No questions would be asked about the Ronin who had fought for him. All he had to do was allow the outer moats to be filled in. Just the outer moats, a gesture of good faith. Sanada Yukimura opposed it. He argued, with the cold clarity of a man who had spent 14 years thinking about exactly this scenario, that Ieyasu was not the kind of person you made peace with on his terms. He had watched Ieyasu operate for decades. He knew the reputation. He told Hideyori that accepting the terms meant accepting that Osaka Castle's defenses would be permanently reduced, and that a reduced castle was a castle that could eventually be taken, and that a castle that could be taken would eventually be taken. Hideyori held the advantage. His walls had held. Ieyasu's coalition was expensive to maintain, and the men in it had their own domains and their own calculations. And if the siege dragged through another winter, some of them might start making separate arrangements. Time was on Hideyori's side. The moment he signed, it wasn't. Hideyori signed. Whether because Yododono's terror after the bombardment had shifted the balance within the castle's leadership, or because he genuinely believed in the possibility of a negotiated peace, or because the prospect of another siege winter in a castle full of proud men waiting for a battle they might not get, was simply unsustainable. The accounts disagree, and the truth is probably some version of all three. The next day, Ieyasu's forces began filling the moats, not just the outer ones. The Toyotomi representatives complained. Tokugawa officials expressed regret at the misunderstanding and said the workers had misunderstood their instructions. The work continued. By February, the inner moats were filled as well, the outer walls partially dismantled, and Osaka Castle, which had held against 200,000 men for an entire winter, was now merely large. Ieyasu sent a polite official communication saying that since an eternal peace had been signed, the walls were not necessary. He had already ordered more cannon manufactured. The summer campaign of 1615 lasted one day. Hideyori had roughly 50,000 men, fewer than in the winter, without the moats, with defenses that had been systematically stripped under the terms of a peace treaty that had lasted 4 months. Ieyasu had 150,000. The castle that had held through an entire winter siege could not hold against this, stripped of the water barriers that had made every assault prohibitively costly. Everything Sanada had predicted was exactly as he had predicted it. Even then, Sanada almost made it matter. The Toyotomi forces left the castle to meet the Tokugawa army in the field, a decision driven by the recognition that a passive defense was no longer viable, and by Sanada's insistence that aggressive action was the only remaining option. His red-armored troops broke through the Tokugawa lines at the Battle of Tennoji and reached Ieyasu's command position. They came close enough that Ieyasu, by some accounts, considered flight. Then the Toyotomi lines elsewhere gave way, the army began to collapse, and Sanada Yukimura, exhausted, wounded, surrounded, was killed where he stood by a Tokugawa soldier who did not initially realize who he had found. The castle fell that afternoon. A fire started inside, from the kitchens, some sources say, which has the quality of an explanation that no one entirely believes. The flames spread. Osaka Castle burned. Hideyori and Yododono withdrew to a storehouse as the fire consumed the keep around them. Senheim, Hideyori's wife, Ieyasu's own granddaughter, 20 years old, was rescued from the burning castle and survived. Hideyori sent messages asking for terms. They were refused. He and Yododono committed suicide in the storehouse on June 4, 1615. He was 22. She was 47. The castle was not simply defeated, it was buried. In the years after the siege, Ieyasu ordered Osaka Castle rebuilt on Tokugawa terms. The original foundation stones were covered over. New construction rose on top of the old. The castle that stands in Osaka today, the one tourists visit, the one that appears on every piece of Osaka promotional material, is built on top of where Hideyoshi's castle was, which is a kind of erasure so thorough it becomes almost architectural policy. Not just defeating the enemy, but covering the physical evidence of his existence with your own work, so that the very ground that remembered him is occupied by something else. The era name was changed immediately after the siege to Gena, and Ieyasu declared Gena Enbu, lay down arms. The 150-year period of continuous civil war that had produced him, that had produced Hideyoshi, that had produced Sekigahara and Osaka, and all the generations of men who had spent their lives learning to fight, that era was declared over. No major armed conflict occurred in Japan for more than 2 centuries. The samurai, who came of age after 1615, were warriors who never fought a battle. And the culture that resulted from that peculiar situation, men trained for violence in a society that had systematically removed the occasions for it, produced some of the most extraordinary art and philosophy Japan ever made. The tea ceremony refined to an almost religious discipline. The no drama, the elaborate aesthetic codes that turned the life of a warrior into a form of performance. The swordsmanship schools that multiplied and elaborated and competed in tournaments that were not wars but resembled them in structure. The sword remained. The fighting it was designed for became increasingly theoretical, increasingly ritualized, increasingly a matter of philosophy and aesthetics rather than survival. Whether this was what Ieyasu intended when he declared Gena Enbu, or whether it was simply what happens to warrior institutions when the wars run out, the result was the same. Ieyasu died 14 months after the siege, in 1616, at 73. He had outlived Hideyoshi by 18 years. He had outlived Sekigahara. He had outlived the Bell and the siege and the peace treaty and the moats and the summer campaign. His son ruled, then his grandson, then 12 more generations, until Commodore Perry arrived in 1853, and the world the Tokugawa had sealed themselves into for 250 years began, with some violence, to reopen. But that was 238 years later. In the summer of 1615, the problem was solved. The root of unrest, Ieyasu reportedly said, had at last been pulled from the soil of Japan. He had used a peace treaty to strip a fortress of its defenses, and then used the restoration of those defenses as a pretext for war. He had fired cannon at a woman's bedroom until she was frightened enough to push her son toward terms he should not have signed. He had promised eternal peace and continued filling the moats the next morning. It had taken one day. Sanada Yukimura had been right about all of it, and he knew he had been right, and he fought the last battle anyway. He had argued, clearly and specifically, that Ieyasu could not be trusted, that the moats once filled would not be returned, that the second campaign would find them stripped of the advantages that had made the first campaign survivable, that accepting peace on Ieyasu's terms was accepting a slower defeat. He had been overruled. He had stayed because the code he lived by did not allow him to leave when the situation became the thing he had warned it would become. He had accepted Hideyori's trust and Hideyori's gold in 1614, when Hideyori had offered him rehabilitation from exile and a return to the battlefield after 14 years on a mountain, and that acceptance carried obligations that didn't dissolve when the situation turned out exactly as he had predicted. The Tokugawa period that followed his death produced an enormous popular culture around the Sengoku era, the wars that preceded the peace, and in that culture, Sanada Yukimura occupied a specific place, the heroic opponent, the man who had been right and had gone down fighting a system he could not stop. Songs were written, plays were written, novels, centuries later, were written. His red armor, the distinctive crimson that his troops wore, that made them visible on the field in a way that was either tactically bold or simply theatrical, depending on who you ask, became iconic in a way that the armor of victors sometimes doesn't, because the victors had the history and the losers had the myth, and myths tend to last longer. He became, in the popular imagination of the Edo period, the ideal samurai, skilled, loyal, prescient, and doomed, which is a combination that Japanese culture has always found compelling. He was the warrior who told everyone exactly what was going to happen, proved his correctness by dying in the predicted way, and left behind no tomb, because he was buried where he fell in the chaos of the aftermath, by men who were in a hurry and did not know or did not care who he was. She had been born in 1567, the daughter of a man who was himself the nephew of Oda Nobunaga, which means she had grown up at the absolute center of the turbulence that produced the Japan of 1615. Her father was killed when she was young. Her family was destroyed and reconstituted, and destroyed again across the wars of the 1570s and 1580s. She had been Hideyoshi's concubine, then the mother of his heir, and in that role she had wielded more actual power than most women of her era, managing Osaka Castle's internal administration, navigating the factions within it, making decisions that Hideyori deferred to her on. She had kept the castle running during the years between Hideyoshi's death and Sekigahara, through the uneasy peace afterward, through the Bell incident, through the winter siege and the bombardment that left her shaking and unable to sleep and, if the accounts are to be believed, pushing her son toward signing terms he should not have signed. Whether she pushed him because the cannon fire had broken her nerve, or because she made a genuine calculation that peace was survivable and continued war was not, or because she understood what was coming and wanted to delay the inevitable. The historical record is ambiguous in the way that the inner lives of women in this period almost always are, documented only in accounts written by men watching from the outside. What the record shows is that she was in the storehouse on June 4th, 1615, when the castle was burning around her, and that she died there. The castle burned. The moats stayed filled. Sanada had warned them. He had been right about every specific thing he predicted, in the order he predicted it, and it had made no difference at all.